In this video we're going to explore a bit more about migration. Now, in studying migratory behaviour, scientists are wanting to find out things like when does the animal migrate, where do they overwinter, do they return to the original territory, how long do they live for, and to do that scientists use various specialised techniques, and you may have seen these techniques when you're watching my famous David Attenborough videos. But the sort of things that we do if you're looking at bird migration is to be using something like a ring system or a banding. It uses a metal band which has a bird's unique number and the investigator's details attached to the bird's leg. And when if the bird is recaptured, then that information can be reported back to the scientist. And here's a little bird here just getting a little ring put on its leg here. You can also tag animals, and here is an example here of a monarch butterfly. It's got a code on it with the tagging, and it's been entered into a database, and if the tag's recovered later, then the route and the distance covered by the butterfly can be discovered. So the scientists would tag the butterfly would obviously fly off, and if it's captured elsewhere, that information can be put into the database, and then the scientists can have a look at where the butterfly has travelled to or from. There are also as well coloured tags that can be put onto animals, and here's some examples here on birds. So there's a tag here and here and here on these birds' wings, and they're good if you want to look at a bird through binoculars and you can spot the tag that's on there. The number that's on these will correspond to information that they've got about that animal already, and that way you can feed that information into the database, see where the bird has been before and see where it's travelled to. A more complex way is to use some sort of transmitter, where the transmitter is glued, or it can be glued to the animal's bodies. And an example you've got here is here, where there's a transmitter there, and here's a wee transmitter tag here fitted onto this shark here. And the transmitter will emit signals that are picked up on satellites, and that signal is beamed back to the ground. And it's very good, this system, for tracing migratory routes of birds and sea mammals. So for example, whales and seals. It does have some disadvantages in that it's kind of pretty expensive to do, and you can lose your transmitter, which will cost a lot of money. And if you use these on small animals, it can cause some sort of drag on small birds when they're flying through the air. So you want to be very careful who you're fitting these sort of transmitters onto. Now, when we're talking about migratory behaviour, maybe you have or haven't thought about this, but how is it that an animal or a bird migrates? Is that something that's innate in it? In other words, it's been inherited, or is it something that it learns from its parents? And there have been sort of some experiments that have been done looking at this, because there's a lot of mysteries around migratory behaviour. And so you've got these two terms here. You've got an innate behaviour. Now that's where the behaviour is inherited. It's in your genes. It's inflexible. It's thought that it plays a primary role in migratory behaviour. It's performed in the same way, the migration happens the same way by every member of the species, and it occurs in response to some sort of external stimulus, such as a change in the day length there, called the photoperiod. We can have a look as well at this other type of behaviour here, and it's learned behaviour. And learned behaviour, obviously it begins at birth and it's gained by experience. It's much more flexible in it's got trials and errors in it. If something goes wrong, then there can be a relearning process from other members in a social group. And it's thought to play a secondary role in migratory behaviour. And there have been various experiments that have been done round about this innate and this learned behaviour. And we'll just go on and talk about those now. So we're going to have a look at this first experiment here. It was around European starlings. And it was an experiment that was done in 1967. I know that seems like a very long time ago, but it was an experiment and it was done by, actually it wasn't a Perbeck, it was somebody called Perdeck. I'll be very upset to know that his name's been wrongly spelt. Anyway, what happens here is that European starlings, they travel from Sweden, Finland, northwest Russia to wintering grounds on the Channel coast of France and the southern British Isles, where it's a bit warmer. And when they're migrating, they pass through Holland. Now, what Perdick did was he transported thousands of starlings from The Hague to Switzerland. And so he released these banded birds. He put bands on the birds and released them in a geographic location in which the population had never had any previous experience before, i.e. in Switzerland. And then he looked and recaptured these birds to see where they had travelled to. Now, the recapture of the birds meant, well, what he found was that many of the birds that amongst the adults, which had previously made the migratory flight, knew they'd been displaced, and they returned to their normal wintering grounds by flying in a direction approximately 90 degrees to their usual southwesterly course. So they ended up in the Channel coastal parts of France and the southern British Isles. But the juveniles, the younger birds, which had never made the trip before, in contrast, they continued to fly, to keep flying southwest, and they were recaptured on the Iberian Peninsula. So these first year birds knew what direction to fly, so they were flying in the right direction, but they did not realise that they had been displaced. So they travelled, they kept on travelling, and they found themselves not in their normal wintering habitat. And in subsequent years, these adult birds would return again to winter in Spain and in Portugal, yet again. But another displacement experiment of starlings was done on the Barcelona coast in Spain, and it ended up with similar results. So Perdick concluded that this migratory behaviour was innate. That is, it's inherited in the DNA. Since the naive juveniles could fly in the direction, and the thought there was that the birds were also genetically programmed to fly a set distance. So it wasn't just the direction they were flying, but it was how far they were flying. But what was actually found, that obviously what had happened as well in this study was that the older birds had some kind of modification that they could take to the experience they'd had. So the adult birds knew that they weren't in Holland any longer, and knew that in order to get to their normal wintering grounds, they needed to fly in a direction that they'd never flown in before. So Perdick concluded that there was some innate behaviour there. In other words, when you were looking at the younger birds that hadn't done the flight before, they ended up in Spain and Portugal because kind of inherited in them was this migratory flight going southwest, but they were still they're flying in that direction, but they were going a set distance. And they didn't recognise that they were in the wrong place, that they weren't in Holland. But the older birds who had done the flight before, they realised that they weren't in Holland and they adjusted it. So the older birds showed some learned behaviour here. Now, there was other experiments that have been done looking at birds that migrated and birds that didn't migrate. Now, here's an example here of, this is a herring gull here, and it is a non-migratory bird. It doesn't migrate. This gull here is called the lesser black-headed gull, and it isn't a migratory one. Now, what happened in this experiment, the eggs were hatched, the eggs were swapped in the nests. So the experiment involved swapping the eggs and looking to see what the behaviour of the fostered birds were. So in other words, what happened was the black-headed gull's eggs ended up here in the herring gull's nest and vice versa. So these black-headed gulls ended up being raised by non-migratory gulls. And what was found was these black-headed gulls that were in the nests of these herring gulls, they did migrate, and that was said to be supporting innate behaviour. In other words, even although the parents weren't doing it, or those who they thought were their parents, even though they didn't do it, it was innate in the black-headed gulls to migrate. Now, the herring gulls that were raised by the lesser black-headed gulls, so this is the other way around, these non-migratory birds, what was found was that they migrated. So they wouldn't normally migrate, but what was found that the adult birds migrated and the herring gulls went with who they thought were their parents, although they weren't. So it was thought that they were following their parents, and that was exhibiting learned behaviour. So you'll see it's not really it's not a cut and dried situation here, that there are these two types of behaviour. It's not a case of one bird only exhibits this type of behaviour. There can be modifications in that process. Now, another type of experiment that's been carried out is this one here, looking at directional tendencies. In other words, to find out whether it's sort of innate in a bird what direction it's going to go in, or what direction it's going to head in. And in this experiment here, it was with black-cart warblers, and there was two populations. So of these two populations, one kind, which is found in Germany, and it always headed southwest. The other kind is Australian, and it would head southeast and then south. Now, an experiment was carried out to find out if this was learned or innate behaviour. And what happened was nestlings were taken, in other words, when the birds had just hatched, and they were hand-reared, so they weren't there with their parents to learn what direction they should be going in. And their orientation, or the direction they're going to fly in when they start to migrate, was tested using funnel cages, or sometimes these are known as Emlyn funnels. And what these are is shown by this diagram that's up here. So what happens is the bird is put into this funnel here, and there's a screen, a grid here to stop the bird getting out. Poor wee thing. And there's paper on the funnel here, and there's an ink pad here. So when the bird decides to set off where it's going to be flying to, it will make scratch marks on the direction it's going. So say the bird's going to be going this direction, then what you would find is there would be scratch marks on the paper at this side here, and there would be none over on the other side here. And that way you can work out which direction the birds are going to be travelling in. And when they did this experiment looking at this funnel, they found that population A that was there always made scratch marks in the actual direction of the typical flight path of their population. And in the same way, population B, they had scratch marks or markings on these funnel cages that showed their typical flight path. In other words, it was showing that they were flying in the direction that they were expected to fly in, even although their parents had never been there to show them that. And so therefore these results suggest that in the birds there's genetic information about direction to migrate, and it's a form of innate behaviour. And on the side here I've just got an example of one of these funnels. This actually isn't a warbler, it's a sandpiper, but you can see the idea. Here's the ink pad here. There's a screen, and obviously the bird can't fly off because you're wanting to work out which direction it's going to go, and it's obviously maybe deciding to go in this direction, and so therefore you'll see scratch marks all on the paper over here and none on the other places that it's not going to go to. So far in this video we've been talking about migration, because it was all part of how organisms survive in adverse conditions, and migration is just part of that. You'll have to make sure that in your notes you've also got information about the hibernation and aestivation and torpor and things that we are in the PowerPoint. I haven't actually made a video of that information. But we're just going to finish off this part here just to talk about this here, extremophiles. Now, extremophiles are organisms which live in extreme conditions that would normally be lethal to most other living things. And an example I've got here are thermophiles. They live in hot springs and hydrovents found in the seabeds, so they can survive very hot temperatures, somewhere around about 50 to 80 degrees Celsius in hot springs. So they're pretty hardy. Now, these are organisms that possess enzymes that function well at high temperatures. And you'll remember a way back the enzyme tag polymerase that's used in PCR. This is where these enzymes have been found in these extremophiles. There are some extremophiles as well that can actually use hydrogen sulfide as a source of energy to make ATP, which is a pretty useful thing to do if you're in a very sulfurous hot spring. So I just wanted to mention them so that you were aware of them. And that is the end of this key area.